Thank you all for coming. Yeah, when I brought the work over and we had kind of set it up, and Adam, there was definitely a reaction. And you sit there and you work in your studio and you're by yourself mostly, and it's all crowded together, and I'm somebody who works on a lot of things at once. It looks really different when you pull it out of that environment I created in and start putting it on a wall. And I also work very detailed and close to the work, so I'm painting like this and not seeing it as much like this because I do deal with intimate subjects. I find that part of my process too, to work so closely with it. But it does come with some things, like for example in oil painting, your oil painting brushes are usually about this long, and this is so you can do this, and because your eye focus is usually about 3 feet away, and that's so that you can paint and you can see where somebody's going to view it at. And my work is very different from that. I feel like if you're standing back from a piece and looking at a large piece, you're there with other people, you're all standing back, and there's a community thing going on. When you have a smaller piece, and it's you in the piece. So getting into that little paintbrush thing for a second, I went from years of taking those oil brushes and I started cutting them because I was doing this and come really close to your eye. And I didn't want to poke my eye out, and I painted tips red and stuff, to try and prevent this. And then I more recently realized that I could get natural haired brushes that were makeup brushes, or fingernail painting brushes that are for extremely small details like my work. The handles are like this, and they're really inexpensive, which also started me thinking about using things that I grew up with as tools, taking those tools that weren't in the fine arts world, kind of repurposing, which I do a lot of, especially with my more conceptual work. Well, they're all conceptual works, but with my more like this. So I started thinking about imprisoned people, and I usually find objects that kind of spark my imagination, and I started collecting like little cages from the thrift store, like little bird cages. And it's kind of odd because some of them are actual bird cages, and they've got a whole line of ornamental fake bird cages too, which is kind of bizarre, like pretending you're going to keep this object in there, but you're not. And they're usually a little worn looking. And I did some sketches of some actual cages, but as I was doing this, I started thinking about how people that are locked up are also first locked out. And a lot of people that we have, because of the way our money's allocated by the government or whatever, shouldn't be in jail. They should be getting help. And there's various reasons why they might be locked out. Some of it is a mental health reason, some of it is a struggling type poverty, both, whatever, addiction, whatever it is, that we have a large population of people that are locked out. And I started thinking more and more about ways people are locked out. It can be the neighborhood you were born in, the family you were born into, the education system you didn't have access to. It could be because of abuse. It could be because you just feel different. There's all sorts of reasons that you could be locked out, and I think a lot of us have been locked out. We have this idea in this country that if you just work hard, the Protestant work ethic, you'll get all these riches. Well, the garbage men work hard. There's a lot of people that work really, really hard, and they are never going to have that. And so I started, instead of collecting the cages, I started looking at the actual locks and the different kinds of locks that lock people out, and studying locks, old ones, new ones. And I found they're all different kinds of locks. But that's something that has gone on for centuries. People have been locked out for centuries, whether you're a peasant or whatever. With the idea of who is locked out, collecting photographs, and a lot of the photographs that I've collected nowadays are online. I will admit I appropriate photographs, and sometimes it's just this portion of it, this person in it, this thing that strikes me as something that I want to work with. So I usually will collect those and print them out and go through them and think about what I would change, and a lot of it was dealing with isolation as well as a bit of mystery with the figures. And I was also looking for I didn't want necessarily specific people, but I wanted people that could be specific people and find the humanity there, and kind of having some knowledge of the kind of person. So kind of a universal. I wanted to deal with children, and a lot of that is because in childhood you're just finding your personhood and who that is, and it really sets who you become, and ultimately trying to deal with one, the isolation it can feel as a child trying to discover who you are in yourself, but also as a time when you're the most vulnerable usually, or one of the most vulnerable times in life is when you're a small child. And there's a lot of mystery involved with being a child. Like, at first you have your little, you might have your little family or whatever going on, but there's this whole huge world out there, and all of a sudden it can penetrate into whatever little part of the world you're living in. So in that same ideas and the studies of locks, I also have a fascination for the still life. When I go to the museum, I don't run to see the Van Gogh. Nothing against Van Gogh. I go to what I call the religious torture paintings. I'm really fascinated with not only the way they painted them, but the fact that that's the thing that they're painting, and they are extremely beautiful and yet also very disturbing. And I kind of find that a metaphor for our lives that can be extremely beautiful. Small things sometimes. The butterfly flying around, the sunrise, the water dropping. I mean, sometimes it's little tiny things, some bigger things. But there's also the whole other side that also can be extremely disturbing with the things that you see. And we sit in this life and it pulls at us. There's this tension, I think, between beauty and ugliness is not quite the right word I'm looking for, but disturbing qualities perhaps. And in my work, I like to use that kind of idea and to pull on. And I also like to use the idea of the unexpected, which goes into, of course, our lives as well, because as much as it's planned, it's not planned, and you can't plan for the unexpected. You never know what's going to hit you on this side. So with that, I got into still lifes over there, a little chiaroscuro going on in the way they're done, like the golden age of the Dutch, which I absolutely love. When you have a vase of flowers and you think, oh, here's these pretty flowers, but really in reality they're symbolic. There's one that's decaying and falling down. There's a caterpillar which is going to metamorphose into a butterfly, which represents mortality, change that we go through with that. And yet you're looking at it and at first you think, oh, what a pretty nice vase of flowers. But it has this deeper meaning to it. I love that idea. It's kind of the unexpected, the deeper symbolic little things. It's like the flickering candle that's almost burnt to the nub that's going out in those traditional paintings. So I started with the locks, and I've done other still lifes, people that know my work. But there's I found out things like there's long shackle locks, and the shackle is this part, and those are used for other things like regular padlocks, the master lock. And you even get into these locks names like master lock, and I started thinking, well, master lock, why isn't there a servant lock? And I started looking at all these different kinds of odd locks in history, like the Jesus locks and the locks with skulls on them, and these exist in the world. There's many lock collectors of all different kinds. It's kind of interesting. So I started kind of working with those kind of ideas with the smaller locks that are, kind of representing of that. I went into the locks with the rosaries, and as I was saying a little bit earlier, on one side, I'm a fourth generation atheist in a Catholic city, which does lock you out of a few things. I also find very much fascination and beauty in religion, like I was kind of saying before. I've always felt this kind of need to make them about things that, more secular things in a sense, to have similar beautiful things that were more for me. And with those, I started thinking kind of about people who pray to a system, and that's kind of the loose word, the pray part, as far as with an A in it, not the E like those are titled. But they pray to systems that are really not working for them or working against them, systems that might prey on you with the E. So I wanted this kind of dichotomy between like the two. And I will admit there is a Sid Vicious implication in there. And some of my titles do reference punk rock songs and symbology just as much as Catholicism. Some of you know this about my background. I grew up in a hippie commune in New Orleans. It was a secular commune. It wasn't one of those Jim Jonesy type things. In New Orleans, uptown. At the height, I lived with 25 adults and a bunch of kids. Some were part-time. They had parents that were divorced that lived there. One of the things that happened was they had this great idea that everybody was going to raise the children together. And what happened was everybody else thought somebody else was raising those children. and we ran a bit wild. I was subjected at a very young age to all different kinds of different philosophies, religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, all of these things. There were people that went and joined the Bhagwan Rajneesh cult in Colorado, which there's a big documentary on about that, which is very interesting. So I was raised around a whole lot of different people, and from a young age, I was able to say what I thought, and sometimes that really, I got repercussions from that as I got older because I didn't have that much of a filter and wasn't trained to, and I've learned a little bit, but For example, oh, look at the cute little girl, and people touching me, don't fucking touch me, having my boundaries. But I always felt a bit out of place in that environment, and then one day I found punk rock, which was... Thank you for it. And that really did change my life and gave me a community of people that were more like me. It was a very big part of my life. Not just the music of it, but the movement was part of it for me as well. Anyway, I go into that with a Sid Vicious little bit reference with the lock. And for those who don't know, he had the chain and padlock on him in many famous photos of him. We get from there into the garments, which read more conceptual and process than I think the paintings do on a level. It's like, a lot of people come to a painting, it's a painting. Of course, you're working with unusual materials and things that aren't traditionally, in some ways, art pieces. It gets into this more, people think more about process and they think more about the materials than they would with an oil painting. And even though I'm doing oil paintings in a way that I would like to think references old masters somewhat, I attempt. I do not claim to be anywhere close to them, but I attempt. And I would say that my materials in these are picked out because of that. But when you get over here, it's just more apparent, and because of the nature of the art piece. There's similarities in just the way I work, and that childhood ideas are definitely, and the mystery and all of that are definitely part of these pieces as well. I started with Snapped. That was about 3 years ago. Let me tell you, I snapped and I snapped and I snapped. I mean that in mental ways as well as physical. The action of putting them together was what I called snapping. I am snapping. I snapped at work meetings. Snapped watching the news. I snapped in my studio by myself, and I snapped and snapped. I got blisters from snapping. There was blood from snapping, and a lot of patterns and thought involved. But how do you make something like this into something that could possibly be worn, and wanting that to be part of it too. And also the reference to chainmail as a protector as well from feeling snapped. So the pieces over here all have that same kind of dichotomy with the ideas of protection and also vulnerability playing against each other. And I wanted to use sewing notions and things like that. For years, I've been collecting at thrift stores, granny bags, we call them. And these are what your grandmother had in her little sewing box. They're little ends, little pieces, and sometimes it's a little bra strap thing that she might need for later if she had to fix a bra strap, or it could be some odd snaps, or she bought some buttons and used half of them and they're in there. And these things get passed down to generations, and a lot of them at this point, because younger people don't sew in the same way, they're like, oh, granny, I don't need this, and they give it to the thrift store and get rid of it. And I look at it and I go, this was somebody's little precious collection of things that was very personal and very taken care of and kept. And so, like I said, I started collecting these years ago, and let me tell you, I've got a pile of these. And then I had this idea of the sewing circle, and I thought, there are other people that have these. Women used to sit together and sew in a sewing circle, and they would talk about everything, gossip, politics, whatever, and about the protection of that, of having a sewing circle and a group of friends, having that group of friends that you can do this with. So I put on Facebook, hey, anybody have some sewing stuff you want to donate? And then I went and picked it up, and I had like a woman I hadn't seen, I went to 5th grade with, I hadn't seen her in decades, and I went to her house and we had tea. And she had things. She says, oh, look at this and look at that. And so she gave me some of the things. And another woman across town, and I went and got those from her. And there was a sense of community to it, which was lost in the pandemic, reconnecting, and sharing some things that were kind of precious with each other. And so I found that really like that part of this whole process. And some of the things, there were things I'd never thought about using as much, would I make something out of this or not? But there they were, and it kind of started to spark my imagination with them. So going back to Snapped, I started with what I called twos, and snaps are gendered. There is a male and a female snap, and so I started putting the male and the female together with a jump ring. So I started making piles of twos, and then I made piles of fours, hooking the twos together to a four, and then I started making strings, and then I started stringing the strings, and I got a little doll's dress pattern, and I laid it out, and I did the front and got it to go pretty well. And then I did another one for the back, and then I have this little mannequin guy that I put it on, and I put it all together, the sides and all of that, and the row at the bottom did this. It didn't meet up like that. It went like this, and I was just like, okay. I went over that thing like you wouldn't believe, and my friends are like, oh, it's the Turkish flaw. Do you know Turkish flaw? Turkish rug makers, weavers, they would purposely put a flaw in their work because if it was perfect, it would be an affront to God. And so I have these people tell me, oh, it's just the Turkish flaw, and I'm just like, I couldn't deal with it. It was making me crazy. I spent like a week, I'd go in the studio and I'd go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I put it away so I didn't look at it for a while. And I came back and I found that one thing that was off. And of course it was off way up in the garment. It wasn't like an easy fix, but I got it. So but I think that's part of the process too, of figuring out something complicated that you might hang up on one thing and you obsess, that's part of it. The next one down the street a little bit there, Unhinged, is a similar idea, only with the little hinges, and the little hinges I found online, and they are used for doll houses or for jewelry boxes. And I thought about the jewelry box that keeps the little precious things in, and I thought about the doll house that keeps the little fantasy in there, and I thought about those falling apart and what happens when you start to unhinge things and our society feels like it's been unhinging. And that's where that idea with the hinges kind of came from. I have a way of where I think, man, I got all these snaps. I wonder if I could. And I will say there's a percentage of these ideas that I wonder if I could that I can't, or I haven't figured it all out yet. And it still maybe could, it just hasn't got there yet. So there's also, that component to a lot of these kind of pieces. Going from the unhinged to We're Never Going Back, which is this one here. And I had this idea of embroidering because it was such a big thing. We're never going back, we're never going back, we're never going back, we're never going back, with rights. But guess what? So I thought about, how embroidering that. I thought about doing some needlepoint with this kind of the same thing, and then pulling the threads out. And part of it is the threads that are holding things together. Or you pull on one thread and the whole sweater starts to unravel. The domino effect of pulling on a thread. If we can put two kind of ideas together there with that. And so I embroidered it in. And if you get embroidery thread of a certain age, which also can come in these little granny bags of things, they're not steadfast, and you get them wet and they bleed. And I thought that was also an excellent metaphor for many things in this piece. So I embroidered the top in, I started pulling it out, and as I was doing that, the top of the dress started kind of to dissolve. And in sewing, you're putting things together. Embroidery, you're mending, you're making, you're not pulling it apart. And my first reaction was, oh, do I need to sew this back up? Do I need to fix this? And then I thought about it and realized, well, this is part of it all. It's falling apart. And even if you try to put it back together, it doesn't ever get put back together the way it was. It might end up differently, it might be mended or whatever, but it doesn't go back to that same thing you had. It's a progression of And that's the way we progress in the world anyway. So I did the top, and then there's such a long bottom, and that is a little doll's dress. It's too small. At first I thought it might be christening, but it's too small for a baby. It's a doll's dress. I started thinking what it needed, on the bottom. I started tatting a number of years ago, which is a form of lace making. I had been given a book by my mom that had as a kid, had all these different kinds of tatting, crocheting, knitting, blah, 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 from Woolworth, little green cover. And I went immediately and I fell in love with the tatting. I'm gonna learn to tat. I might have been 9 or 10. Needless to say, I didn't learn to tat. In fact, it was really hard and I just couldn't do it. Years later, my mother gave me the same damn book. Now I don't know if it's the actual same book she gave me before and she refound it and gave it to me again, or she found another one and gave it to me. I'm not even sure. But I went through it and there was the tatting. And I was like, oh, tatting. And so I went to YouTube. And let me tell you, you can learn just about anything you want on YouTube. And so I learned to tat on YouTube. And then I found out my great-grandmother tatted, which, you know, it skipped a couple of little generations in there, but I kind of felt like it was a tradition that I was supposed to do. Reading more about it, lace making in general, they think tatting, for example, and crochet type stuff goes back to Viking women who made nets. Extremely complicated patterns not written down. There still is not a universal pattern of tatting. You can read the Australian type pattern, or you can learn to read this pattern, and it hasn't even become one thing because it was passed down without writing it down for so long. And I thought about all the really complicated things, mathematical patterns and things like that got passed down this way, that I really think saved a lot of very smart people that were not able to use their brains because of their gender, because they were women, and how that, I think, helped keep their brains and sanity alive. And I also found that messages were put into these, like during World War II. They were able to get messages out from behind enemy lines through things like weaved into lace making or quilts, Revolutionary War, all of that kind of things, that this was also a way of spreading information that totally went unobserved by people that shouldn't have had it because it was women's work. Needless to say, getting back to the tatting, they're little doll hangers, and of course the hanger referencing the choice thing, abortion, and I had wanted to make them that kind of unexpected thing where from far away it looks floral, and you get close and it's not floral, to add another layer in there of meaning to that. So that's that piece. The blue one, it's actually dark blue, it looks black. With the eyes, in India, there's an embroidery called shisha, which is the little mirrored thing, and you might have seen shirts with shisha embroidery on it. And when I was in India, I was very fascinated watching, which let me tell you, I can't do shisha like those women could do shisha. But the idea is with the little mirrors that it was a reflection of the evil eye. The evil eye looks at you, it's reflecting it back so you don't get the evil eye. A lot of different cultures of that kind of throwing and warding off evil type thing. And there was a part of me that wanted to be not reflecting back, but to say, hey, don't even come here. That kind of protection of oneself, as well as the peacock, with all of the eyes in the peacock who scares away predators because of this idea of being bigger and able to protect yourself that way. Yeah, I went on YouTube and learned how to do shisha myself. Fought with it a bit, but that's where that one came from. The last one, the needles and pins, which is also one of my favorite Ramones covers, I will say. It's The Seekers, and it's a lovely song. Just want, with a similar to the other ones, trying to use these things that I grew up using for a different purpose. At the bottom, there are rounded hooks, needles. They're to fix couches and pillows so that you go in and you can pull it out, so it's not a straight pin. You can get it from around there. And I also found out when I was looking at them that they're used for hair weaving. They have this weird, almost claw-like quality. How do you protect yourself? You don't have that many resources. It was that kind of what I am going to use to try and do this. And the little floral parts are straight pins that are no longer straight, that I made into little floral, elements. And then I guess we have here the 5,853 pricks dress right here. That was also one of those things that was both deals with the same kind of repetitiveness to work things out as the snapped and the unhinged. Well, actually kind of all of those have that quality to them. And it was one of those things like, what if I just started sticking pins in this thing? What would this look like? And what would it be like? And what would it? So I just started working on it, and I found it's best to start at the top and not at the bottom. And working with kind of a design element, which is part of dealing with garments, and the whole beauty versus danger thing going on. Most people want to touch it, and it is not that nice to touch. I started realizing things like, since it's gathered, some of the pins would cross and some come out, and that makes a pattern of itself. And then in hanging it, when Adam and I first hung it, but I will say that the shadows in that, with the way it's looked very female to me. And I was okay with that. Anyway, any comments, questions, observations? I also want to thank Adam and the gallery and Amy and everybody that made this possible. My friends and family and support, and
Happy birthday, Jessica.
Yes.
Happy birthday.